Closer. Right, okay. Those of you that have had the misfortune to hear me speaking before will understand why I've had to write out what I'm going to say rather than just get up and rant. So yes, as a former child protection social worker, I have major concerns about safeguarding issues in relation to the beliefs underpinning gender ideology and the organisations being allowed to inculcate this flawed belief system into our schools. As Sam has outlined, the organisations that are leading this lack expertise in education, childcare, safeguarding, child development, but they're receiving massive amounts of public funding to develop policy and practice and deliver this training to introduce that ideology across schools. There's a huge conflict of interest with no scrutiny, oversight or evaluation of what they're doing or its effectiveness. But we have a range of legislation in Scotland designed to promote and protect the welfare of children that applies to all organisations working with children, and that means schools. The Children's Scotland Act tells us that the paramount consideration is the child's welfare. Key principles within that legislation include that parents are normally responsible for the child's upbringing, that a child has a right to protection from all forms of abuse, neglect or exploitation. Any intervention in a child's life by a public authority must be properly justified. The National Guidance for Child Protection in Scotland states that abuse or neglect may involve inflicting harm or failing to act to prevent harm. So those being silent, take note. Emotional abuse includes exploitation or corruption of a child or imposition of demands inappropriate for their age or stage of development. Again, authorities, take note of the guidance going into our schools. The needs and rights of siblings should be considered in any process that has a focus on a single child. So how does all this fit with the guidance being rolled out across our schools? Across the legislation, a child is generally regarded as any child or young person under the age of 18. In any other context, a young person under 18 behaving in potentially harmful ways or where an adult was causing harm, it would be regarded as a safeguarding concern. So for example, in my previous practice as a social worker, if I was working with a young person who was self-harming as a means of coping with and responding to abuse and trauma that they'd experienced, my reaction, supported by my professional organisation, was not to say, yes, you're absolutely correct, you will feel better by self-harming, that will solve your abuse, here's the blades to do it with. But we are saying that now to young people displaying gender, body distress or confusion. They're encouraged to believe that they're born in their own body, which is Sam said is utter nonsense, and encouraged down a pathway of drugs and surgery. So evidence from the interim review of the CAS report and other research tells us very clearly that it's largely vulnerable children and young people that are being targeted by this ideology. A third of young people going through the gender identity service at the Tavistock with autism and other neurodiversity looked after children, so the children that our state has a responsibility to care for and protect, hugely overrepresented in that body. Young people with high rates of anxiety and depression, with experiences of abuse and trauma, significant levels of internalised and family homophobia. in the young people being dealt with by the Gender Identity Service. So this is, as well as being thoroughly misogynistic, this is a deeply homophobic ideology. It is telling our young people, and the schools and the education department in there are telling our young people that because they don't conform in their early years to traditional, typical, gender stereotypical roles and dress and behaviour, that they're not really little girls and boys, that they're really little girls and boys born in the wrong body. And a wee boy wanting to play with dolls isn't really a wee boy, is really a wee girl, and he needs to go on drugs. It is absolute nonsense. The evidence of the harmful effects of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, not to mention surgery, are being utterly ignored by our authorities. And it's difficult to conceive of any professional promoting such treatment as doing anything other than inflicting harm. Interventions based on lies, so it's not possible to change sex, no child is born in the wrong body, and ignoring evidence of harm cannot be construed as properly justified intervention. Sidelining parents and encouraging children to keep secrets is not consistent with the principles of our safeguarding legislation. It ignores evidence from sex abuse scandals indefinitely of the extent to which children are encouraged to keep secrets and threatened with negative consequences if they tell. This is classic tactics used by abusers, and requiring that of children in school is a groomer's charter. The Cass Review identifies very clearly that social transition is not a neutral act. There are significant risks to the child of being encouraged down a pathway of medication and surgery with harmful, irreversible consequences. It ignores the evidence that most gender-confused or distressed children grow out of that as they develop. There's no child development theory that supports the notion of a trans child. But in a school context, the harmful effects go beyond the individual child. It ignores the needs and rights of siblings as specified in the legislation by requiring them to not only adhere to a falsehood about their siblings' identity, but to keep that secret from their parents. It puts peers under pressure to accede to a false and flawed ideology or risk accusations of discrimination and to engage in secrecy. I would argue that this is emotional abuse. Young people have to be 18 before being entitled to access information about their identity if they're conceived by donor sperm. But a child at primary school is considered competent to make an informed decision about changing their gender. Attacks on women's rights are integrally connected with these attempts to indoctrinate children into gender ideology. Women are generally the protectors of children and the gatekeepers to those seeking access to children. Undermining women's rights and silencing women's voices is being used as a cynical attempt to remove safeguards for children. Women won't wish when it comes to defending our rights, and we certainly won't wish when it comes to safeguarding our children. So I challenge Glasgow City Council to produce the evidence base to justify their decision to implement policy developed by non-expert ideologues and disregard professional standards and expertise, ignoring key principles of child safeguarding legislation. Give us the evidence!